Well, we're just back from a couple of pretty memorable days riding in Arrow, north of Sydney, Mangrove Mountain, with the 2025 Yamaha Tenere 700, all new bike. Had an amazing trip between here up to Cessnock. You know, huge thanks to the Yamaha Motor Australia guys, Greg Yeager and his crew at Ride ADV, and then Chris Watson, who we sort of had an overnighter with and then stayed up there. About what, 2/3, 3/4 of that 400 kilometres off-road. And just a really good opportunity to, get a chance to test this bike. I think Yamaha's not calling it a launch because the bike's been in dealer floors now for, probably a few months, 21,300, so it's 1,500 up on its predecessor. So it was more of an event, but just a lot of fun and great to get out. And I really need some what's kind of like that, some adventure bike therapy myself. So it was a super nice couple of days. So let's have a look at this bike. So rather than running through all the upgrades, and it's interesting when you look on it on paper, there's nothing astounding, but I think collectively when you look at all those upgrades, they really amount to something quite significant. And I think having ridden it for the last couple of days, that really sort of reinforced that view. So like I said, rather than going through each bits and pieces at a time, let's sort of bring it to life and see sort of how those mods actually translated into a different riding experience. I think one of the most obvious things is the ergos. If you look at it, doesn't appear to be huge changes. A little bit narrower, tank is lower and further forward, and that's kind of really significant in that, I think, the seat, you're sitting a lot closer, you feel much more connected with the steering head. So I think most guys who come from a dirt bike background, that's a kind of cool thing. You feel like you can sit down and tip it into corners rather than your classic adventure. Oh, here comes a corner, let me stand up. That was a really big thing. While we're talking ergos, fortunately they've adopted the massive foot pegs that came from the World Raid, came out a couple of years ago, the bigger version of this with a 23 litre tank and beefed up. That's cool. I think if there was one kind of criticism really from the ergos, from the original Tenere, or the original 700 parallel twin that came out in 2019, 2020, was that you had to ride a little bit bow-legged. But by having these bigger pegs, slightly wider, it gives you, one, a really nice planted feel on the bike, but two, means you don't have to ride bow-legged, and as a result, you can move around the cockpit a lot more. Also, it's moved to a one-piece seat. So, you could argue the profile of that is actually very sort of similar to the two-piece, but I think, again, just from a psychological point of view, it feels like a dirt bike. A couple other little things, I guess, from an ergo's point of view. Yamaha sort of, you'll see a lot in the advertising, they've said sort of, you spoke, we listened, it's like listening to their customer base, but they've twisted the clutch cover about 35 degrees. What they've actually done is the clutch actuating arm, they've moved that significantly so it's not impeding your legs as well. Big difference just from an ergo's point of view. Oh, and I guess, while we're talking sort of bodywork, now the front screen used to be in 3 pieces, now it's a 1 piece. I think it's about the same size, but just nicer, easy to remove, just less fiddly. There's a new headlight, which looks pretty cool as well. The other, I guess, criticism of the original Tenere was maybe, look, great suspension. On corrugations, on 90% of riding for most people, and most adventure riding people do. So on the road, and then when you're off-road, whether it be corrugations, little rocks, all that sort of small stuff, it's super compliant ride. When you're hitting erosion mounds, just lacking in that progression, particularly in the fork. So they haven't jumped all the way to, to say the beefed up 43mm carb that the World Raid has got, but they have added 15mm of preload and spring preload. I think they've actually done more than that. Yamaha hasn't actually said it. Feels like they've beefed up the internals a little bit. So the cool thing for me is it didn't lose any of that plushness where you need it 90% of the time, but every now and again where you hit a G out or you launch off an erosion mound, you're like, shit, this is not going to be pretty. On the old one, much more progressive at both ends. So that level of adjustability was pretty significant. While we're talking suspension, on the rear, there was also a little bit of criticism that the linkage was sort of snagged a little bit, so it ran off the back of the bash plate. So they've got some different dog bones now. I think they're steel rather than alloy. That changes the linkage ratio a little bit, and has also created that extra progression in the rear end of the bike. Without necessarily losing any of that compliance. And I think that they've done all this interestingly. I said, oh, why didn't they put the bigger, more beefier fork in that they put in a World Raid? Because that's 20mm more travel. But then I thought, well, this is not trying to take on the World Raid. For people who want 23 litre tank versus this one's 16, they want that firmer suspension. But if you were to add extra suspension travel on this, you've also got a higher seat. And that's a really big, it's a kind of like a, seat height can be a deal breaker for some people if they sit on this thing and it's too high. So just being mindful that it's on the small side of the mid-capacity adventure bikes, and that its seat height is critical. So the engine, I mean, the engine on this bike is an absolute peach. It sounds like, that 270-degree cross-plane engine sort of sounds like a V-twin. It purrs, and it's always known for being super linear and smooth. Sometimes to the point where it's too linear and smooth, and Yamaha's argued that, well, we haven't had to, put any electronic intervention on this or traction control because the engine, it's actually built into the engine, which is actually quite true. But I guess if you're jumping off a bigger bore, you want, just give me a bit more excitement. And the cool thing that really surprised me, they didn't make much of a thing about it, but it's got a small snorkel in the intake. And apparently that collectively with just some of the size and design of the airbox, it gives it actually a bit more snap, a bit more throttle response at lower revs. So I really like that in that, when you're on a gravel road and you just want to get it out, even when you're at 3,000 revs, you can do that. You just got that extra response. You want to loft the front over, like a little pothole you see at the last minute, or a log that, just has that extra little bit of snap. But by the same token, I think it's still got that beautiful linear. It just absolutely purrs. What else? Electronics. So the original Tenere, in a way, sort of Yamaha painted themselves into a corner that says doesn't come with any gimmicks, no electronics, no unnecessary intervention. It was just a raw, pure riding experience. And in a way, they were right, but those rider aids, the electronics have advanced a long time in the last 5 years since the first Tenere has been out. So Yamaha, I think, done a pretty good job. Again, the consumer spoke, we listen, integrated in their advertising. Consumers, the biggest thing I think is the ABS. So before it was just on or off. Now they've adopted the same system that they had on the World Raid, which is a pretty easy system and a much better functionality in terms of turning it off. You've got an ABS button, so one hit for 3 seconds, turns the ABS off, turns traction control off, and 90% of us today, journos on this launch, just rode with everything off. So I think that was a really big thing. You've also got sort of two modes now, Sport and Explore. Explore just a sort of tamer version, and then you've also got the traction control. So, and then on top of that, and this, this is all through a 6.3-inch, TFT screen, bigger than the 5-inch predecessor. Really easy to read in full sunlight. Really easy, really functional. Aided now by some little joystick controls. They thankfully got rid of that ridiculous sort of little shithouse wheel that they had on here, which was flat out dangerous. And I think, so it's introduced in a clever way electronic aids, into this bike, and done it in a way that just works. You're not like constantly going, shit, where's scrolling through and trying to figure things out. Talking about the ABS, I think, look, I had it off all the time. I tried it, with just rear off, the enduro or off-road setting. So you get to control your rear brake, but the front's still on. Before I even thought I was going to be anywhere near locking the front, I had that wooden shuddery feeling with the front brake lever, so I just turned that off entirely. But it's nice to have it there, when you're on the road in slick conditions, particularly if you're running knobby tyres. You get out on the road, you're tired at the end of the day, and you get a slick bit of hot mix in the wet on the road. Kind of just nice to have that there, and really easy that it can be switched on and off really quickly. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning is what they call it, the YCCT. I think Yamaha chip-controlled throttle, basically a fly-by-wire, which allows all that electronic advancement. One thing I noticed just when going from a trailing throttle to when you're actually first coming on the power, I want to say it's a little bit jerky's probably a bit cruel to say that, but just not quite as smooth, as I guess the old school cable. That's a pretty small quibble, really, and I think it's something that they'll probably sort of iron out with this bike in time, but that's one thing. The other thing, and I should have mentioned it when I was talking about ergos before, I took the pillion pegs off this because I sort of found that they stood out here, they're almost like a bloody, like a steg peg. They kind of got in the way a little bit. So I took those things off. I think the bike actually looks a whole lot cleaner and nicer, and if you haven't got a pillion on the back, that's a really cool thing. I think Yamaha's done a bloody good job with this bike. When the predecessor came out in 2019-20 at sort of 17.5 ride away, that's got up to 20. This thing's another sort of 1,300 on top of that. So I think I mentioned before 21,300. But it's a really good offering because I think it's kind of kept that essence of what all those original Tenere guys, and believe me, there's some diehards Tenere guys out there. It's kept the essence of what that bike is, but made it more modern. You know, the silhouette is more modern. It's sleeker. It's more functional without resorting to sort of gimmickry on the with the electronics. It's made a little bit more exciting, you know, in terms of like punch and agility, you know, thanks to the slightly narrower tank and the riding position, and yet it retains that sort of, you know, that trademark stability, you know, of this machine. So I don't think it's trying to, you know, it's not trying to take sales away from its World Road, like the beefed up one with the 23 litre tank. I think some people might be disappointed that you still only got 16 litres and probably only about, you know, a bit over 300, maybe 330 at a stretch, 350 at a stretch, fuel range on the thing. But, you know, I think all in all, there's very, very little to complain about, you know, with this bike. And I think, you know, Yami are right, they've listened and they've made judicious upgrades to the thing. They've done it right. They haven't done it with a huge extra price tag. You know, I think there's a hell of a lot of good reasons for if you own an existing one of these, why you'd be thinking long and hard. And well, actually, probably wouldn't be thinking that long and hard at all. It'd be a pretty easy decision, I think, because all those collective small upgrades, as I've sort of been through, I think all of them make this a significantly better bike. And a hell of a lot of fun to ride. You know, confidence inspiring and just what adventure riding's all about. No surprises, a lot of fun. Yeah, had an absolute ball. Well done, Yamaha. Be really looking forward to spending a little bit more time on, you know, on this machine, mucking around with some of the suspension settings, and because you now have that adjustability, seeing what it's like with a pillion on the back, that kind of stuff. So we'll be doing a little bit of that extra testing in the coming months.